Welcome to all of our panelists, our discussant, and to all of our attendees in the audience. I look forward very much to hearing all of your thoughts and perspectives on this executive session roundtable on centering Africa and China in global transformations. My name is Justin Lee Haruyama. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. My own research centers on Chinese migration to Zambia, and I study various domains of emerging relationality between Chinese and Zambians, including through religion, through language, through kinship and family, etc. And we have a very distinguished set of panelists today. Before I go further, I would like to provide a brief land acknowledgement, which I know that there are different norms of regarding land acknowledgements in different places, but where I'm speaking from in the Okanagan, this is considered very important. So I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I live and work in the unceded and ancestral, also stolen territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. I acknowledge my own positionality in this space that I am speaking from this morning as a settler. And I also acknowledge the important custodial role that the Syilx people have played in the Okanagan region since time immemorial. So before we begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about where this idea for this panel came from and what sort of my goals for the panel are. And then I'd like to turn it over to each of our four panelists, as well as our discussant, to introduce themselves before launching into some questions that I have prepared. So this panel comes out of a long-standing engagement, especially my connections. Some of our panelists are also leaders in this group with a research network called the Chinese in Africa, the Africans in China Research Network. And through my engagement with that network and the scholarly questions that have emerged, it's become really apparent to me the very strong Eurocentric and Western-centric focus of much of contemporary scholarship, especially critical scholarship, that's trying to address the violent, brutal power disparities of our contemporary world and the resulting marginalizations that occur, and a lot of critical concepts such as race or colonialism or capitalism or patriarchy are treated in a very Western framework. And if the Global South appears in these frameworks, the Global South is often figured in its relation to the West. So for example, migration coming from Latin America to the United States. In this panel, what I really wanted to do was to develop a conversation by looking at two critical nodes within the Global South itself and look at how the emerging interrelations between these two nodes can transform our understanding of social science research generally, as well as these kinds of critical concepts specifically. And though, as is often said, China and Africa are quite mismatched in terms of their level of political scale, China, of course, being one country, and Africa a great variety of many countries. I think if we look at the populations of both regions, China being 1.4 billion and Africa being 1.2 billion, then looking at them and the same level of scale starts to make more sense. So I've prepared a list of questions. Our panelists have had a chance to review these questions and develop their answers. We also have a distinguished discussant, Mei Zhan, who will be providing answers to these questions providing a discussion of our answers at the end of this session. And then I hope to open it up for about 15 to 20 minutes of question and answer from all of the panel participants. So with that introduction out of the way, I'd like to hand it over to each of our panelists to provide a short introduction of themselves and maybe just a couple sentences about their research. If it's okay, I'll just go in the order that you all appear on my Zoom screen. So if I could begin with Dee.
Hi, my name is Dee Wu, and thanks for Justin's invitation. And I'm glad to participate in this roundtable discussions. So I'm currently in University of Oxford. I'm a departmental lecturer working in the social anthropology department and also Migration Research Center at Oxford. And then my doctoral research was like Justin's. I did field work in Zambia, in the eastern suburb of Lusaka, looking at Chinese agricultural technology demonstration center, i.e. those Chinese aiding projects in terms of developing African, specifically Zambian in this case, Zambian agricultural technologies and productivities. And then, so I was in the farm for 16 months. And then that was my main field site. And by looking at labor relations and communication issues and also ethical interactions, etc. And then through based in the educational farm, I was also in contact with private farmers who built their own vegetable farms in Zambia, coming from China, mainland of China. And then I did a little bit periodic, kind of a couple of months of field work with the private farmers as well, by looking at how the kinship structures and social networks, and especially emotions, the constitutive role emotion takes and affect takes in building migration community, basically.
Thank you, Dee. And next, Derek, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, thank you, Justin. My name is Derek Sheridan. I'm an assistant research fellow at the Institute of Ethnology at Academia Sinica. My research focuses broadly on geopolitical imaginaries and the ethics of global inequalities in Africa-China relations. And my first project, which is now a book and a long period of preparation, is an ethnography of entrepreneurial migration in Tanzania. I did my fieldwork with Chinese migrant entrepreneurs in Dar es Salaam, particularly in the wholesale market of Kariakoo. And I'm mostly examining how Chinese migrants and ordinary Tanzanians come to depend on each other for their livelihoods, as well as their social mobility or lack of social mobility within an uneven and hierarchical global and local political economy. And my second project, which I've been working on for a while, concerns martial arts genealogies in coastal Tanzania. So I've been interviewing and working with Tanzanian martial artists, some of whom offer alternative genealogies of the origins of martial arts, and in the process, partially decentering what's often a very kind of state-centric focus on Africa-China studies and in South-South connections is primarily something that's happening between states like China and African states. This kind of turns out on its head in many ways. So that's what I've been doing before, and that's also what I'm doing now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Derek. Sarah.
Sorry, my mouse disappeared for a minute. Good morning and greetings to everyone. I am Sayram Avle. I'm an associate professor in the communication department at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I come from slightly different background from most folks here. So my work, yes, Mingwei. I study the design, manufacture, distribution of digital technologies across regions. I'm particularly interested in what African tech entrepreneurs make and what Africans imagine technologies to do. Some of this work connects with China, where a lot of the hardware is made. And so I've conducted fieldwork in Shenzhen and have been following a network of tech entrepreneurs that kind of move between the south of China and Ghana, Ethiopia, and sometimes Nigeria. I am currently working on a project trying to make sense of data flows between the continent of Africa and China, right, through various modalities. And I'm happy to be here with anthropologists and my first anthropology conference.
Thank you. And Mingwei.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mingwei Huang. I am an assistant professor at Dartmouth College here in New Hampshire. I appreciate the land acknowledgement, Justin. I work and live on the unceded land of the Abenaki people. So I am here based in a gender studies program. I am a field worker. My training is more in kind of the interdisciplinary studies than sociocultural anthropology, although I come in and out of the AAA space from time to time. My field work, from the get-go, I was kind of in the Africans in China network. I work on Chinese entrepreneurial migration to Johannesburg, to these kind of wholesale markets, or they're called China malls in Joburg. I started that research in 2013. My kind of investments and vocabularies really come from American studies and critical ethnic studies, where my PhD training is in. So in my book that's in production now, there was a bit of a crisis in the titling of who's my audience? And so I'm kind of between kind of the area studies frame and ethnic studies and American studies. So it's the Chinese century in the City of Gold, racial capitalism after whiteness. And I'm going to talk about those terms a bit. And then my deprovincializing kind of theory is one of my projects, and I'm very aware of my position, right, in the kind of Anglophone Northern US Academy. For my new project, I'm looking more at extractivism and toxicity and mining in kind of South Africa, Joburg, and the DRC, and a bit North America. So thank you for convening us, Justin.
Thank you, Mingwei. And lastly, Mei.
Oh, yes. Hi, everybody. And thanks, Justin, for inviting me to join this roundtable. I'm an anthropologist, and I work at the University of California, Irvine. What should I say about myself? Well, I used to work, well, I still do to a certain extent on the translocal movement and circulation of traditional Chinese medicine, mostly in China and the United States. So in my first book, there was actually quite a bit about the circulation of Chinese medicine between China and African countries. Sub-Saharan African countries, and right now I'm finishing a book on boutique firms, entrepreneurship in what's loosely defined as classical medicine. So in China, outside of the establishment. So the focus is actually on, and I'm so looking forward to today's discussion on. Well, one of the focuses is on how people rethink the question of theory or theory making, right? Not as abstract organizing principles and structures, but rather as something that are themselves emergent. So as Justin was talking about, right, capitalism, development, colonialism, colonization, so on and so forth, how they actually come to be, right? How they emerge and get enacted in everyday life rather than just theories that we all live by. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation and hear more about your projects, which are also exciting and fascinating. So that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, May. All right. With that, I will go ahead and present some questions to our panelists. And to the panelists, I think that you should feel free to just jump in at any time. If, as the conversation continues, you find it easier to raise hands first, if we find that people are talking over each other by accident, we can switch to that system. But I think to begin with, just feel free to jump in with your answers. So my first question to our panel is, how would an analytic centering of Africa and China, rather than North America or Europe, change anthropological scholarship or social sciences scholarship more generally? So perhaps maybe I could throw it out to Dee to get us started on this conversation.
Right, thanks. So there are 2 points I think I want to reflect on. One is the position of China within this discourse of so-called decolonizing knowledge production process in the West. So what position China is actually holding in this whole geopolitical new kind of world order? In a way, China is very much trying to claiming its own space, not just as a developing countries, if we can use that term, but also more as a new superpowers. The whole discourse Chinese government is creating at the moment, when they're reframing the world order, is very much a complicated one. It draws on the past socialist memories and the internationalism, and also draws on the decolonization discourse, and also draws on their own visions of what China should be, and then the glorious days of all under the heaven, etc. So it's very much complicated one. Within this new kind of a system, hierarchical system of the world order, in what ways we should perceive China, and then especially theories coming from China. I think from my own experience working in the British universities higher education, I don't think China in the British mind certainly is classified as global south. So in a way, but they are not as more obvious as the theories from global north. So in a way, China is in a very awkward position when it's come to knowledge production. So that's the first my reflections on how the theories coming from China, Africa can contribute to the general kind of theory making in the world. And then the second is corresponding to this change of there is undeniable, there is a shift and a change of the world order. And then China is really having its impact, not just economically, but also more and more culturally and socially and also politically. So in a way, we've been, I organized a kind of a workshop roughly about 2 years ago, talking about how China is actually transforming the context of people's life on the ground. So if anthropologists, major kind of methodological two is to contextualizing in order for our to understand human actions on the ground. Then when China is transforming the whole landscape or having their footprint on the whole landscape of all the people on the world, then in what ways we need to corresponding and change our ways to understand this context and the ways to how to contextualizing it. So yeah, that's my two reflections on the question.
Perhaps, Saram, I know you've done some thinking on sort of entrenched Euro-American epistemologies.
Have I? No, I mean it's a really interesting question. And yeah, I mean the caveat I would say is I don't know that this is a possibility in the current way that we are engaging with our various epistemologies. In part, like you just said, I feel like your American epistemologies are very much entrenched in what we all do. In a way, it's really like I have difficulty imagining another, but that doesn't mean that there isn't the effort or acknowledgement of the effort to decolonize. But part of the challenge for me is because these efforts to decolonize are often very much on the level of sort of like a gesture of some sort, right? I think I like this notion that decolonization is not a metaphor, but in fact, that's how it's being used a lot. So, the pessimism aside, I think to take your question, and engage with it genuinely, I think what might change might be some of the vocabulary that we use, right, in our work. And so a lot of, and I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who thinks about Africa, writes about Africa, is from Africa, is African, and the general sort of anti-Blackness that I observe globally, right? And pretty much it's quite pervasive, and it's really hard to sort of avoid that. And so in scholarship, I think some of the language might change around. So for instance, this sort of development optic that is continually used for Blackness and Africa in general. And so centering everything around notions of, is Africa developed? Does Africa look like Europe? Is Africa catching up to China? Is Africa doing East Asia? Blah, blah, blah. It's this linear modernity logic that Africa seems to be continually behind and trying to catch up with. That perhaps might change if we're able to center Africa a bit more. And to do this might be to locate African lives, African perspectives, Africanness in and of itself. It's impossible because we're social beings and we're always connected to people. We always compare ourselves to others. And so that logic of sociality exists in academic work and in the way that we think about the world. But if you center people's lives and where they're from and their histories, Africa right now has no history, right, in the world's imagination. And so perhaps maybe beginning from that perspective and locating our work in these kinds of modes of thinking about taking at face value that a specific people are their own, have their own sets of histories. Our history did not begin with colonization. Africans were around, but the construct of Africa itself is problematic, right? And so it's a difficult question and task, but I'm willing to sort of engage with it on the level that perhaps it will change the way we talk about people's motivations, their values, their affinities, those kinds of things, the relations that they form with other humans on the planet. And we might not, default to using these sort of developmental tropes and deficits of trying to be or catch up with, the Europeans and the Americans. I'll stop there and let others kind of jump in.
I'll say a quick thing, even though I didn't sign up to talk about this question. But I mean, on the matter of, I think, deprovincializing theory. I mean, I struggle a lot with this, with everything that I/many of us write. It gets modified with Chinese racial formations, Chinese racism, Chinese anti-Blackness, Chinese capitalism, Chinese empire. When I think what we really just need to be saying is race, anti-Blackness, racial capitalism, colonialism. The modifier of Chinese, what does that do? I think that's because so much of the, what gets called theory has been produced within the, US and European Academy. Um, and that really comes out of histories of Euro-American global domination. And we're in a different moment now for at least the past 25 years, that the kind of center of gravity, if we think about things like capitalism, um, white supremacy, colonialism, empire as global systems, the center of gravity is shifting to the PRC. It doesn't leave Euro America behind, but the kind of the frameworks need to be need to adapt, and to put Chinese as a modifier. It doesn't. I think it does a disservice. And on the, and not just to China, but to, what we call the global South, and to Africa, like, the kind of the place of the continent and the BRICS economies and China have taken in the world. I mean, it's a different kind of capitalism. Um, um, and so the other thing, I really like Petrus Liu's new book on kind of, he was really making this case, speaking to like US queer theorists, about the need to deprovincialize theory and questioning.
The voice sound is off.
Sorry, Mingwei, we lost you there about 10 seconds ago. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back now.
Oh, okay. Maybe my AirPods died. But just questioning what we call theory, what is called area studies, and that theory itself is actually really provincial. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for those excellent answers. In the interest of time, I'm going to go on to the second question, and I think really picking up on Sarah, what you were saying about vocabularies, and Mingwei about deprovincializing theory. So I'd like to ask the panel, if we think about critical concepts such as race and racism, empire and colonialism, capital accumulation and racial capitalism, migration and diaspora, thinking from and centering Africa and China in global transformations, are these the best analytic tools for understanding South-South connections today? And of course, as Dee was pointing out, China occupies this very ambiguous place between the global South and the global North in these questions. And I have two sort of sub-questions within this. So if these are continue to be useful concepts as we center Africa and China in this scholarship, how do the concepts change as they become dislodged from their more familiar historic and geographic contexts and potentially unanchored from global whiteness? And if they are not the best analytic tools for understanding South-South connections today, what are the alternative conceptual vocabularies that emerge from your particular work, ethnographic, especially work, and what new conceptual ideas can you draw from that? So I'd love to turn this over to Derek to start us on this question.
Yeah, maybe I can sort of begin to answer by kind of linking to the previous question as well. I mean, I think just I think it's one of the challenges is in talking about shifting or recentering from the West, or like we might say like north-south relations to south-south relations, is I think it's by looking at it as a transition, as a change or a recentering, one is sort of assuming one that either there's a succession, like an imperial succession, one is replacing the other, or one is imagining something completely different. And I feel like it's kind of ignores the way in which South-South relations is already co-constituted within North-South relations. To even talk about a recentering, we're already assuming something's going to be different or the same. So I think it's hard to get away from some of these analytics, like even what the definition of South-South cooperation is entirely framed about what it is not. The model of South-South relations is a kind of form of relationality within the world, which is not imperial. But it already presumes imperialism as sort of the basis for conceptualizing it. And I feel a lot of the debates over the conceptual vocabulary comes around this issue of taking these kinds of stances of that this is something different. Or this is the same. And I think by seeing either continuity or difference, one misses sort of those kinds of relations which were sort of already there within the development of, say, for example, imperialism. So I mean, a good example of this is the way that Chinese migrants are characterized. Chinese migrants going to Africa, there's also African migrants going to China as well. But the focus on Chinese migrants going to Africa is often to think of them in terms of, are they similar to settlers or not? And the comparison to white settlers is not unjustified, but it's also kind of strange because there have already been Chinese migrants in Southeast Asia during the European colonial period. There were Indian, South Asian migrants in Africa during the colonial period. And many of the same kind of positionalities they had within the colonial system, that is a form of economic privilege alongside a form of political vulnerability, is ironically reproduced even now, despite the so-called rise of China. Not for all migrants, but for different types of migrants. For traders, for traders in particular, maybe not for state-owned company, state-owned enterprise expatriates. And so the fact that these continuities exist, as well as a lot of the continuities of these kinds of discourses, shows that we're dealing with a sort of longer genealogy. That I think it's the idea that they're separate kind of obscures. And I feel with the debate over empire in particular, there seems to be two different kinds of debates happening at the same time. One is, again, like Mingwei talked about the issue of the modifier and this legacy of area studies in which China is always an area. China is never anything but an area. So it can only be something outside. And I think even more so than other regions of the world, which have like even in anthropology, for example, a lot of anthropological theories developed out of ethnographies based in Africa. Even if those ethnographies were based on this kind of ethnographic dehistoricizing present stance, still ideas of segmentary lineages kind of comes out of a tradition of looking at Africa, whereas China never really contributes to anthropology because of a weird way it's kind of set aside. And I think that's one issue with the modifier. But it's the debate about what China is gets mixed up with the debate of what empire is. So there's been an interesting inversion where there seems to be a lot of critique of Chinese financial relations with African states and with other states as a form of debt colonialism. And this is coming from major political figures in the West, which are suddenly discovering that debt is a form of an imperialism. Whereas on the other side, there's a whole more sort of a boisterous crowd for China as an alternative, which is arguing, well, actually, debt is fine. You need finance as a form of development. And so in many ways, you find that kind of a technocratic discourse oftentimes in a lot of the debunking narratives that go alongside arguing that China is not an empire because it's just a normal capitalist country. Okay, so it's interesting how the stances are often shifting here. And it's not really an issue of what is the definition of empire or the definition of race, but what do these terms mean in this sort of geopolitical contest or knowledge production. So I think that one of the challenges is to kind of disentangle these debates and to kind of ask, when these terms are being used, how are people deploying them? And even with these these problematic vocabularies, how are these vocabularies, even if, for example, debt trap, for example, it's a term which everyone tells us it doesn't exist. I think we all know that that's not true, but nonetheless, that language already has a social life of its own even within our own field sites. And same thing with empire. How does terms like colonialism get used by ordinary people themselves in their interactions? I've had experiences where people will say, "Oh, this is just like colonialism." Oh, no, it's not, and they're arguing over how much they should pay one of their employees. And so I think we got to look at the way that these terms are kind of deployed, not just by academics, but also by people with whom we do field work. I think it's sometimes a mistake to think that by doing field work, we've somehow escaped into the world of the real, away from the world of the fake, which is theory. When I want to actually find theory and grand narratives among the people we interact with in the fields like themselves. And so I think a part of decentering is not just about decentering regions, but also considering the way knowledge is being used in particular settings and being deployed in particular contexts, and which can vary from location to location. So I think it's a question of not whether critical concepts work or not, but how are these concepts actually being used? If someone says this is racist, well, what do they mean by that? And if they say this is not racist, well, what is behind that denial of commensurability? So I think it's taking an ethnographic perspective towards these concepts might be helpful. Oh, I'm gonna stop there.
Should I jump in? I can jump in. So my project kind of started in 2013. And I think that was like, I was really, my imagination was really piqued by kind of this milieu of popular writing on China-Africa engagements from the early aughts. So books like, China Safari, China's Second Continent, right? Titles you probably know. And I wanted to complicate these grand narratives of, it was either, this neo-colonial thesis of a Chinese scramble in Africa, or the South-South cooperation kind of legacies of kind of third worldism. And when I started in 2013, I think the CAAC network, or the China-Africa Studies field, was kind of undergoing an ethnographic turn of sorts, so a shift away from the macro analyses and the focus on international relations and state actors in the field. And at that time, it was, colonialism, racism, empire, they still are really divisive, but I think many years ago, it was really hard to have those conversations at all. And what I've noticed is that in recent years, I think more and more people are kind of shifting from kind of hesitantly engaging with these terms, where these terms are kind of only questions, like at the end and the conclusion, but really engaging with them and theorizing, race, racism, empire, colonialism, what these might mean, with far less apology. And I think we might think of this field that I'm increasingly hearing called Africa-China studies instead of China-Africa studies as undergoing somewhat of a decolonial turn. And so because it was so fraught to talk about neocolonialism or empire, I kind of was looking for other kinds of analytics and conceptual vocabularies. And I think we just need to try many of them. And I think every kind of field site or kind of historical juncture will have kind of different kind of configurations of these terms. But a few that I used, so through ethnography, I was trying to push back on this Chinese neocolonialism thesis. So instead of thinking about like a singular totalizing force of Chinese capital, I'm trying to think about, Chinese capital as projects, right, where it's heterogeneous and contingent. And I'm really kind of thinking with like kind of the feminist anthropology of capitalism, right, like Lisa Roffel, Sylvia Yanagisako, Hannah Appel, Karen Ho, et cetera, Anna Singh. And I also want to problematize these abstractions of China-Africa flows as like a generic global capitalism, but think about Chinese capitalist projects as, racial capitalism with distinct colonial entanglements and features, which is a slightly different way of saying neocolonialism, but saying there are these colonial entanglements, these longer histories. So racial capitalism, one quote that I think is really great from Ruth Gilmore. So a lot of the racial capitalism scholarship, it's based in South Africa, but also from a lot of the work is from US Black studies and based in the North Atlantic. But Ruth Gilmore says a few years ago, of racial capitalism, quote, there's white people capitalism, but that's not all capitalism. There's a world movement of racial capitalist relations. Those relations do not all emanate from the global north. North American centers of power, economic and military power, and they matter and they remain racial. If all white people disappeared and capitalism stayed, it would remain racial. And I think that's really useful to think about Chinese capital as racial capital. And scholars have also kind of looked at this kind of settler colonial kind of aspects of racial capitalism. So like Derek mentioned, thinking about Asian settler colonialism, like a lot of that work has been done in like Hawaii, North America, but also in South Africa. So thinking about, I think we just need different kinds of frameworks for looking at these kind of relations. And the last thing I'll say is one term I've been looking at, thinking with, is anti-Blackness, kind of from Afro-pessimism and Black studies. And I think that a lot of work in the Africa-China studies space stops short of naming anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism. And I think a lot of work treats Chinese and Africans as like each racialized, that kind of creates like a both sides equation. And it treats kind of anti-Black and anti-Asians racisms as commensurable under white supremacy. And I do think that there's something specific about anti-Blackness that is more than, individual ignorance and attitudes and cultural norms, but is like global and historical, and names a specific violence and kind of global system and distinct logics in which everyone, including racialized, right, non-white Chinese people, are embedded. So that's another way of thinking about white supremacy, whiteness, anti-Blackness. So I'm gonna pause there, but I can add more as we go.
Well, wonderful.
Can I just say one quick thing, because I like where Mingwei ended, sort of like the utility of thinking about racial capitalism, and I like Robinson's way of historicizing it, right? That's why it remains valuable in terms of thinking about relations between China and Africa, or Africa and China, however you want to position that, and this nod to thinking about longer histories, right? So and sort of relations between peoples and groups, right? Empires existed before the phenomenon that we sort of have put at the center of all of these sort of discourses, right? In different parts of the world before European colonization, formal colonization in these African countries and elsewhere, which seems to be the fulcrum around which a lot of these discussions rotate. So thinking about, well, the relations between empires prior to that particular moment in history. So the longue durée of power is an important way of thinking about all of these things. And it might attune us to these relations between Africans and Chinese today, right, in these spaces. So when I'm talking to Africans as they live their lived experiences in Guangzhou, and Chinese entrepreneurs in Accra, what are the relations that they're having with each other? What histories are they drawing on when they think about the other, right? And sometimes Western ideas or lives are implicated, but most of it is actually really about the time and space between these two regions and how they understand their lives to intersect, right? And so my sort of other way of responding to this is thinking about, and I think May mentioned this, like translocal connections, about Meijan mentioned this, about how people sort of relate to each other. And I think that's a useful way of locating these alternate vocabularies, which is the question I think that you kind of began with. Yeah, so I'll let you continue, but there's a lot this is just to draw attention to sort of thinking on a longer sort of term, but also very specific localized sites in order to see alternate ways of framing, if that's the task at hand, right? So there's a methodological sort of point in there, and not just about theory. Yeah.
Fantastic. This is such a rich conversation. I wish that we could delve into these questions a lot more. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to give one final question now to make sure that we have enough time for discussing comments from May and also for question and answers from the audience. But I think picking up especially from the invitations of Mingwei and Seiram and the answers you just provided, I think that there's a real danger in some discourses that center Africa and China in global transformations perhaps too much and adopt a certain kind of presentism where historical connections and the longue durée of power relations fall away from the frame of analysis. So my next question to the panelists is, how do the afterlives of various kinds of imperial formations, particularly European colonialism and neocolonialism, but also other kinds of imperial formations, how do they continue to shape the success or failure of contemporary Chinese involvement in Africa, even as Europe itself recedes as a locus of global political power? And relatedly, because some of us are ourselves from imperial metropoles like the United States or the UK, and even if we're not from those places, most of us are based in institutions located in those global North imperial metropoles. So how does that affect our own positionalities and subjectivities as researchers? And how does this longue durée of European colonial influence in the regions of the global South, including China and Africa, shape our role as researchers and the research we produce?
Can I just jump in there for, yeah, okay. So I'm basically drafting a paper on how socialist internationalism plays out, that kind of a memory, collective memory, being played out through the interactions between Zambians and Chinese, even though the contemporary Chinese Zambian interaction is very hierarchically asymmetrical. But they somehow to clarify this, so it matters in terms of generational differentiations between the attitude, in terms of attitude towards the Chinese involvements in the local networks. For example, for the people who, especially the case I was describing in my paper, was very much on this farm manager who was doing on a scholarship to the USSR, to the Soviet Union. That time was the Ukraine, to study agricultural technology. And then he was, that's 10 years ago when I did my field work there. So he was in his late 50s and early 60s, late 50s. And when we were chit-chatting about his attitude about China, and he especially expressed his concern on the collapse of China, just like Soviet Union. And then with the collapse of China, and then we end up in Zambian futures would become uncertain again. So this historical kind of a link between the socialist movements in the back in the 1960s, 1970s, especially when certain of African countries trying to achieve independence, does affect a certain kind of interactional patterns when they these days when they interact with China, and how they perceive China as a kind of a new type of matching, kind of metaphorically matching what they understand in what they experienced historically. And then by comparison, I think when I was interviewing the local, the young Zambian workers in their 20s, and then they didn't know much about this socialist involvement of China, especially symbolized by the Tanzania-Zambia railway building construction. And then their attitudes very much influenced by, at that time, was the general election, which made anti-Chinese kind of domestic party, the Patriot Front, got elected. And then the whole discourse was very much based on China is the comparative new colonizing forces. So China is the enemy. And then, so how this kind of understanding of China is very much tied to how these categories and memories are mobilized and then interconnected to the geopolitical kind of tension. That's how I see kind of historical colonial decolonial kind of histories, how that linked to the contemporary China-Africa interactions. And then by reflecting on, again, sorry to pressing less point, as a Chinese anthropologist, it's extremely difficult to engage with this kind of, when it comes to theorizing China-Africa, extremely difficult because in what position China, especially Chinese anthropologists, takes in this hierarchy. On the one hand, there is a strategic kind of usage of Chinese government trying to use decolonization and third world alliance as a kind of a legitimate political discourse to engage with the American endorsed system, ideologically endorsed system, when they engage with Africans, even with a malicious intention sometimes. But at discourse level, they're trying to justify it by engaging with this, and which make any type of argue for decolonial movements, etc., all this South-South theory making, accidentally complicit with the Chinese government regimes. And then, on the other hand, Chinese scholars are not really in the Western, in terms of Anglo-American intellectual hierarchies. Chinese scholars are certainly not as treated as equally important as the Europeans or the American intellectuals. So in a way, again, it's very much, the position is very much in the not equal, but not unequal. It's very weird, asymmetrical problem. So that's my reflections on the positionality in terms of how we make contributions to theory.
I think I have time for perhaps one more answer from our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to discussing comments from May. If anyone would like to get one last word.
Well, maybe I'll just follow up on Dewa's second point about sort of knowledge production, because I think if we're talking about, recentering Africa and China, it's more than just simply like it's necessarily more than an analytic kind of move. It's also a question of, well, institutionally, is there an institutional shift on where the studies of these are happening? So the fact that so much Africa-China studies still happens and sort of is set by agendas in Europe and North America is still an issue. I mean, we are the American Anthropology Association meeting we're having, where this is all very North American based, and so we're still having this conversation about how do we change our thinking, but it's a question of who's doing the research. And I think one of the questions that comes out is there is a huge growth of scholarship in China about Africa recently. Is there growth of research in Africa about China? And if so, who's funding it? And so Kudos Sabadayo has a paper about him trying to do field work in Guangzhou and sort of the difficulties of doing so with an African passport. Not just in China, but many parts of the world. And so I think that's an issue as well, is sort of as the knowledge production changes, sort of institutionally, how are we promoting decentering in addition to simply changing how we think, but also institutionally, are we shifting the institutional production of knowledge? Is the knowledge coming from not just China, but also from African institutions as well about these relationships? So not just end with that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you once again to all four of our panelists for this really, really rich conversation. And as I said, I wish we had a lot more time in this panel, but I hope that we can continue these conversations on into the future together. I would like now to turn it over to our discussant, Mei-Jian, to provide some thoughts.
Thank you again, Justin, for your invitation, and thanks to everyone here on this roundtable for just an incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation. I hope that this is the beginning of something long-lasting and larger. So I share actually a lot of the same concerns that you all articulated just now. I have a copy of your written comment responses too, and also what you just said at this roundtable. And I think there's a shared discomfort, dissatisfaction with the analytical tools that are available to us at our disposal as we try to understand I'm just going to say relations. Words are dangerous. Relations between, that in itself is interesting, right? And it's not meant as a criticism, sort of China in Africa, but Africans in China. So that itself is already not a symmetrical, right? Circulation or formation. So I think we all struggle with theory, with vocabulary. And one thing that I think that really comes out so strongly in all your comments is the idea that sort of the problem, maybe it's not the ethnographic materials or the reality or the history or what we see as ethnographers, as historians, as anthropologists. Those are not the problems. These are not the problems that we try to address or try to answer in our research and also in our write-ups. The problem might be the theory itself, right? And I just feel this, I've always felt this way, but increasingly strong these days for the inadequacy of what we can work with conceptually. That said, I think you are all already developing your own conceptual frameworks in your own work, and that comes out very strongly as you kind of go up against sort of these broad theoretical categories as such as decolonization, development, capitalism, socialism, right? So you're already doing the work, and I think then the next step is how to articulate what you do and to what audience, what kind of conversations you or we actually all want to construct through our work, through our research, and through our own voices. And for just to start, theory, right, is often used as an explanatory device, right? Something that we all had to learn when we were in graduate school, right? But theory is as explanatory as it is something that needs to be explained. So a lot of times, we're all in one way or another in conversation with various variations of Marxism, right, including materialism. which has kind of made a comeback in the form of new materialisms in, I don't know, recent years or not so recent years, I don't know. But what gets lost a lot of times is the materiality of theory, or rather theory making itself. Right? Certain theoretical conceptual devices become abstracted and universalized, actually. And then the problem is, oh, well, it doesn't really fit, especially when it comes to something like China, Africa, or China, right? Because I remember even in the 1990s when David Harvey was huge in everywhere, and I remember, sort of like he gave a 3-day Wellert lecture at UC Irvine. It was all about globalization, blah blah blah, and then the last 20 minutes was, oh, but there's China, and it doesn't really fit. Right, that sort of thing that will make you think, well, maybe the problem is not China. The problem is, is the 3-day lecture. So anyway, but I think we're all already doing the work on our way to really critically rethink not only particular kinds of theory, the inadequacy of capitalism, right, as an organizing principle or organizing concept, but the very practice of theory making itself. Right. So in other words, I'm going to bring up something else that's taken a heavy beating in anthropology in the last few decades, which is relativism. Right. We all know it's like, oh, we're too cool for relativism, but are we? Right. We've relativized our field sites. Right. We've relativized our cultures, and we know somehow it doesn't really quite work, and that's absolutely right. But have we really adopted the same approach to theory and theory making? Not quite, right? And that actually comes down to a very old complex, modernity complex, which is Cartesian dualism, right? And it's not just an academic debate. It's also something that's increasingly dangerous in the contemporary world, the polarization, the duality, the dichotomy of everything, right? So right, taking sides right away, black and white, good and evil, so on and so forth. And in this case, theory and ethnography, or concept and fieldwork material, or field site location, so on and so forth. Right. So I think I think you are all working towards decolonization, not only in the conventional sense, but also kind of interrogating these entrenched habits, analytical habits of how we see the world and how we represent the world, how we articulate our visions and understandings as scholars. So that's one. And then, so what is specific, since this is a roundtable about China and Africa in global transformation. So what is specific about this particular? I've been thinking about this as after Justin invited me, and also as I was reading your comments. So what is specific about China-Africa relations, right? Or China-Africa in global transformations now? I know that this is an ongoing conversation that's already happening, and I know Derek and Mingwei are contributors in the New World Orderings, right? Edited by Lisa Rofa and Carlos Roja. So I know this is already an ongoing conversation. And a very exciting and necessary conversation. And what comes out so clearly from this conversation just now is that ideas such as colonization or development, right, or capitalism continue to dominate our understandings of, right, how things work out. I feel very uncomfortable, I have to say, about just saying Africa, because it's not a country. Right, in these sort of, but then, right, and it again reminds me of, since we're talking about history, so anthropological history too, in the olden days, right, if you study China, you study foot binding or kinship, right? If you're studying India, you're studying caste. And so here too, and then you have this kind of, it's inescapable. And I remember in the olden days when I was starting off, some of the safer topics in China studies was minorities, ethnic minorities, and traditional Chinese medicine. And guess what I do, right? I mean, I don't think I'm doing that, but sort of the parameters of the field are also kind of limited or defined or shaped by the kind of habitual conversations in how we conceptualize not only Africa or China, but also the world, right? And just to give an example, and these are contested categories, right? Whether China is a developing world country or a developed country, right? It's not set in stone, and it's subject to reinterpretation and political struggles. When our Congress just announced, was it this year or last year, or China is no longer a developing country, right? So what is it? So again, I think there are a lot of the problems might not be what we're dealing with in the field, but what we have at our disposal. And I think this is really the beginning of a very exciting conversation. I really want to see more efforts in provincializing theory. Not only particular kinds of theory, which also needs to be done, but sort of theory making as an enterprise itself. So thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, May, for those extremely helpful discussing comments. So this leaves us with about 20 minutes left in the allotted panel time. And so at this point, I would like to open up this discussion to everyone in our audience. Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. I once again want to acknowledge that for lots of people, the time zones may have been wonky. So greatly appreciate everyone who is here. So now open to anyone in the audience. If you would like to raise your hand or unmute yourself and direct a question, you could direct it either to one or two individual of our panelists or to the panel as a whole. Look forward to any questions that our audience might have. You're also welcome to share questions on the chat if you would like. Marcella?
You're muted.
Are you not able to unmute yourself? Okay. I'm not sure what settings were left on by the tech people at the beginning of this session.
We're good.
Oh, you figured it out. Okay,
yes,
fantastic.
I did. Thank you so much. This was such a great conversation. I really enjoyed hearing it. I just passed my dissertation defense at Michigan State University in anthropology. Thank you. And my research is about China, Latin America, and perceptions of the public of China's influence in Tijuana. But with that being said, I really liked all of the points you all made, and I really want to think about this. A lot of these conversations that have to do with China's influence or China's relations with other countries, et cetera, as a lot of you rightfully stated, is very much entwined with ideas about geopolitics and economic flows, investment, et cetera. And as anthropologists, we often get relegated to studying ethnic groups, studying migration, studying entrepreneurship, et cetera, as a lot of you do, which is really interesting. I am interested to read all of your work. But I have a question about how do you all think we can frame anthropology as a social science that can allow us to illuminate some of these illuminate the ways that we talk about geopolitics, global relations in a way that is more both relative, but also cognizant of legacies of colonialism, of racism, imperialism, et cetera, in a way that's grounded, I guess, is my point, where we're not trying to generalize China's influence everywhere, but understand that it's articulated in different ways in different contexts. But that doesn't allow us to be ignored, as I feel sometimes we are. In these larger conversations about what does this mean? What do these global changes mean for the world and for people in the world? So yeah, any thoughts about anthropology and the study of these kinds of relations would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Justin, do you want us to answer the questions as they come, or you want to collect them?
I think I think answer the questions as they come would be best.
Okay. If I may, I am, I guess, the one who's not an anthropologist here. But I draw a lot from anthropology in the work that I do. So I publish across 3 disciplines. I publish in communication, I publish in human-computer interaction and STS. And a lot of what I rely on to help show the connections between geopolitics, broader histories, and the things that my ethnographies reveal come from anthropology, right? I borrow extensively from work that has been done to show these kinds of connections and draw them and make them visible in these other spaces. Not that those places aren't cognizant, but it is a different sort of academic sort of trajectory, right? Like HCI work is quite different. And so those of us who do this kind of work have been put into critical computing as a category. And sometimes we're lumped in with the sustainable folks. It does, there's like these boundaries that are being continually drawn and redrawn. But the value there is that we're committed to drawing across to wherever we find value in sort of intellectual traditions that help us illuminate some of what we see, right, and to help us theorize. So I don't, maybe anthropology as a discipline may be invisibilized in some way, but the work that anthropologists have done is not hidden in that sense, right? And we also try to draw attention to anthropology's history, right? So we all use ethnographic methods, but it's difficult to do that without locating where that history of ethnographies come from, going to Papua New Guinea and being like all the problematic histories of that, we also flag. But anthropology is very much alive elsewhere, if you will. And we appreciate the work that anthropologists do.
I'll just add a short thing. I think it can be very frustrating to try to make the kind of ethnographic insights we're doing in these local sites matter to kind of people who are really invested in the geopolitical and the IR, and sometimes or to make non-state actors, ordinary people, their experiences, their theorizations, their critiques, not an afterthought. And it's tough. It's because sometimes it feels impenetrable. And I find it helpful to talk to other people also. And I think some of what we have to do is to question, theory making, also scale making. So, I do think I look at like these like remittance flows, like these small, relatively small, right? If you're comparing it to like the enormous mega projects, relatively small amounts of money that are sent out. But in aggregate, that actually becomes a lot. And it becomes very meaningful to people on the ground, and what that represents. So I think ethnography is really well positioned to like take those very specific localized sites with very specific racial and colonial histories, and to see, what China represents to people, who have experienced colonization and decolonization within a few lifetimes. Like it's not that it's kind of in the collective consciousness. So I think that is kind of why ethnographic approaches to thinking about race from like the inside out, the bottom up, to see how ordinary people make sense of colonial legacies, how those things materially manifest, right, in ways that kind of macro frameworks cannot conceive of, right? I think we can be much more dexterous and nuanced in that way.
I think I'll also jump in with some of my own quick thoughts. That's an excellent question. So one way that, one example of the way that I see the importance of anthropological expertise in ethnography and really grounded analysis is, like, for example, this question of race and racialization. So, I mean, all the time in both popular and also a lot of scholarly discourses about China and Africa, people say, oh, Chinese are racist against Africans, and Africans are racist against Chinese. And then you have apologists also who say, no, it's not racism. But there's often very little engagement with, I mean, there's a presupposition of Western race categories and Western styles of racialization that hardly ever goes unchallenged. So one of the things that I try to do in my work, for example, analyzing Zambians' racialization of Chinese, is starting from the place not of European or Euro-American racialization, which assumes that Chinese and whites are different racial categories, but instead starting from Zambian ideas that Chinese are white, and analyzing, therefore, how Chinese are figured, especially as they're a growing presence in Zambia, within existing Zambian ideas of hegemonic dominant forms of whiteness. And so I think, I mean, this is an example, in my view, of the real importance of grounded ethnography in changing the very framework and terms of debate that otherwise get sort of just polemically thrown around like a bouncing ball both ways in discussions of China, Africa. And you also brought up the point of how we get people, broader publics, to listen to sort of the ethnographic expertise that we build up as anthropologists. And so, on a separate note, I'll say something that I've been invested in is, well, for example, there's something called the Op-Ed Project. I don't know if you've heard of this, but the American Anthropological Association, at least for several years, I think still does, offers fellowships, funding people to participate in the Op-Ed Project. This is something that I did several years ago, and I've since then tried to place op-eds in major newspapers in Hong Kong and the US. And so I think, thinking with Mei John's comments about, the problems of theory. One problem with theory, I mean, it can both constrain our thinking, but it can also constrain our communication. And there's a danger, I think, in a lot of anthropological work of coming across too theoretical, and therefore limiting our ability to communicate outside of our narrow sort of scholarly and disciplinary boundaries. And so I think things like the Op-Ed Project and developing more public-facing scholarship in blogs such as like Somatosphere or in The Conversation is a great way to share what I see as really profoundly important anthropological work that is being done through ethnographic engagement with these spaces. And I will turn over to Wan Gui, if you would like to answer your question, ask your question rather. Okay, also muted.
Okay, so
Great.
thank you. I'm actually able, I don't have a question, so can defer my opportunity to someone who actually has a question, if there is one.
I think you had your hand raised for quite a while, so I think the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I came a bit late, so apologies if I missed some stuff. I'm still talking to you from Nairobi. I ended up writing about China without it being my focus, and it was very accidental. And why I bring that up is because I think that part of the effort today is to try and decenter the normative registers that we think with and think Africa and China by themselves. And so one thing I'm saying is that sometimes because of our relationship, you end up writing about China without meaning to write about China. For example, I write about infrastructure, but then I need to write about the China Road and Bridge Corporation. So because of that, I'm not sure what concepts to operate with sometimes. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that sometimes you end up writing about China, Africa without meaning to, but it's good. It's good to think about these things. I also wanted to say that, for example, in the University of Nairobi, if you're really not allowed to think in terms of racialization or racial capitalism if you're writing about China, Africa, and I saw this explicitly in a recent 2018 Afro-China conference, where the themes you're offered were really limited. And so this prevents larger conversations, deeper conversations that we need to have, because the Chinese embassy paid for a lot of the conference. A lot of the people at the University of Nairobi have done PhDs in China. And so this limits the more, it really does limit the conversations you're able to have. And so if you look, they're not, at least from Kenya, most of the literature is expected when it's writing about China, Africa. And so it's just, I just wanted to flag these real structural impediments to having necessary conversations on China and Africa, or Africa and China. So that's all. Sorry, not a question, but just some reflections, and thank you all.
Well, thank you for that. And I think actually that raises some very important points that maybe I will recast as questions, if you don't mind, in our few remaining minutes. One question that it makes me think of for our panelists relating to, I believe Derek was talking earlier about questions of funding. I think, particularly, I mean, it's a luxury in institutions in especially the United States and Europe, maybe to a lesser extent, for example, in Taiwan, where funding is abundant and therefore funds a certain kind of academic freedom. That we don't need to be worried so much about being responsible to certain kinds of state actors in our scholarship. And African institutions are not nearly as well funded. And so I wonder, since none of us are based at African institutions ourselves, Kudus Adebayo unfortunately could not join us for this panel. I wonder, as a question to my audience, are there ways that we could, from our own scholarly positions, work with African scholars and bring in, I feel like African scholars are often quite marginalized in discussions of China-Africa. And as Wang Gui mentioned, perhaps because of issues of funding, are not given free rein to explore the scholarly avenues that they would like. So I wonder if you see, like concretely, from our own scholarly positions, if there's any ways that we could engage with African universities and individual African scholars to a greater extent in scholarship on China-Africa relations.
If I may, I see some examples even within the CAAC space where I believe most of us met. There's a thread from a while back I remember where someone wrote something and Lloyd Amwar sort of responded and said, you know, it's lovely everything you've said, but you haven't cited any of the Africans who've written on this. And sort of drawing attention to a certain citation politics that is visible in a lot of the work, right? It's not that Africans aren't writing about the stuff, it's who's citing them and whether or not we are doing that. You know, I think Derek mentioned kudos and the difficulty of African scholars having access to sites and being able to do so. And so when they write, I think it's important that we cite them, given the logics of citations and what that means for attracting resources and promotions. And then the other is observing alternate arrangements. And so I've noticed that at the University of Ghana, while the Confucius Institute and the Chinese embassy have a strong presence, I've seen efforts to cultivate a different line of inquiry around Asianness and Asian countries, so Japan, Korea, as a sort of counter and a way of engaging these conversations. And I'm not sure how it's working, but I observe it as an effort to sort of sidestep the fear of Chinese influence within that space and say, let's build a center that also cultivates scholarship on Japanese, Korean engagement, Indian engagement, and then sort of try and do a regional sort of approach. And it's a different entry point, and I think it does really interesting work. And that's so maybe identifying and supporting these strategies in addition to maybe changing our citation politics a little bit might be concrete ways of doing this in addition to some of the other suggestions that I think Wang Gui suggested and I've heard from elsewhere. Yeah.
Well, our panel is officially over right now. The Zoom room will remain open for another 15 minutes. So anyone who needs to take off now is welcome to do so. I'm welcome any of the other audience members, if you would like to ask one final question while we're still here on Zoom. If there's any final questions from the audience. Or any final comments or reflections or observations from any of our panelists that you would like to share?
I can't wait to see all the books come out.
I think there are going to be a ton in the next couple of years. I think a ton. Yes, it's exciting, you know.
Yeah.
Dee, I'm glad to meet you on Zoom like this. I don't think we've met yet, so.
I think yeah, even Derek, I never met Derek in person. I feel like I know
Yeah,
Derek
it's true.
for years and years and years. I've never,
Yeah,
it must be.
is anybody here actually in Toronto? Yeah. I went to Seattle last year, but that convinced me not to go this year in Toronto, but
Why?
nobody was there last year.
Nobody liked Seattle? I liked Seattle. Conference, that is.
Oh, sorry, I think the message got cut. Didn't catch all of that.
Oh, sorry. I thought, did well, I mean, I enjoyed the conference in Seattle, but it was not as well attended as I had hoped.
Yeah, I feel like the AAA meetings have gotten much smaller post-pandemic.
Yeah. And I
At
think
least the in-person component.
it's not just the AAA, it's happening for a lot of other conferences and workshops, and so much happened virtually during the pandemic, and I think people are having a hard time switching back. And there's, I think there's merit, there are virtues in holding physical meetings. Yeah.
Is there a movement in AAA against meeting in like specific places? We've observed this in some of the, like in CHI, computer human interaction, 4S. Some of it is around Hawaii, but some of it is in general, sort of like climate impact of flying usually it's a bunch of Europeans and Americans to different parts of the world. I wonder if AAA has been having that conversation as well.
I mean, next year it's going to be in Florida, right? So
okay.
Yeah, I wonder if people will. There was boycott Florida discussion. I'm curious, we'll see. But I don't mind the virtual, like honestly.
There's something to be said about grabbing, say, a spontaneous cup of coffee, right?
Yeah.
Or continuing the conversation.
I mean, the one problem about the virtual is it takes out the element that's the best part of actually going to conferences, which is not attending panels, actually. It's the conversations that happen on the side of it. It's really the whole formal structure actually impedes actual enjoyment. I mean, but that being said, I agree that I think there was a moment like several years ago when there was a chance to sort of rethink the entire model of, I mean, not just an issue of carbon emissions. I think this also goes back to the final question of decentering where knowledge is produced. The fact where some of us are able to fly anywhere to do field work, but others are restricted on where they can do field work is a huge issue. And I remember someone made a comment during the lockdown period that, well, maybe we don't need to be training graduate students in Europe and North America to go do their fieldwork in the global South, but rather using that same money to train people in the global South to do fieldwork there.
Yeah.
And as much as it's almost like self-defeating for those of us who were going to the system, it's in many ways that would have been a more institutional, that would be more than a metaphor for decolonization, is to actually decenter the institutions. But it seems like fundings and scholarships continue to go to supporting people from Europe or North America or East Asia to do fieldwork abroad. So yeah.
Sorry, Mingwei, go ahead.
Oh, I gotta peel off. We got a 9:45 meeting. Someone thought the session was until 9:45, but actually 90 minutes is pretty short for a roundtable. I appreciate May, your comments, and everyone for being here, and I feel like my brain's not fully on yet.
Same.
I'm gonna go cook breakfast, but it's nice, really nice meeting all of you, and I really hope that we can continue this conversation. And it's just, I cannot tell you how happy I am to see all these projects happening, and all these shared concerns and all the innovative things that you are doing. So I very much look forward to all that.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this roundtable. As I said, I think for almost all of you, this is my first chance really to get to be in even a virtual space with you and to get to hear you talk at length about your work. So it was such a huge pleasure for me to get to do this with all of you, and I look forward very much to having many wonderful and productive, generative, scholarly conversations together in the future.
Thanks, Justin.